Everything was smooth until it wasn't. The flight was boarding, passengers were settling in, and the hum of pre-flight preparations filled the cabin. Then, out of nowhere, a flight attendant's sharp voice cut through the calm. "Sir, you need to leave this seat." The words hit like a slap. Her tone wasn't just firm, it was accusatory. The man in the neatly tailored navy suit looked up, his expression unreadable. Around him, heads turned, eyes darting, the shift in energy immediate. Then came the sound that changed everything. A click. A beep. Phones were out. People were recording. The atmosphere thickened, anticipation crackling through the air like static before a storm. And what happened next? No one on that plane could have seen it coming. But before we dive into this unbelievable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you love gripping real-life stories, hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more where this came from. Alright, back to the airport. It was a bustling afternoon, travelers weaving through terminals. Some rushing to make their connections, others idly browsing overpriced souvenirs. But one man moved with quiet purpose. His navy suit was crisp, his carry-on rolled smoothly beside him, and in his hand, a ticket, first class. He barely glanced around as he approached the gate, handed his pass to the agent with a polite nod. The scanner beeped. A smile. A gesture toward the jet bridge. No issues. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin smelled faintly of fresh coffee. Attendants busied themselves with last-minute prep. He stowed his bag, adjusted his tie, and eased into his window seat. A moment of peace. He pulled out a book, eyes scanning the pages. Then, "Excuse me, sir." A shadow loomed. A flight attendant, standing stiffly beside him, arms crossed. The sharp edge in her voice made a few passengers glance up. "Can I see your boarding pass?" He met her gaze, slightly surprised, but handed it over. She scanned it, her frown deepening. A pause. Then, abruptly, she shoved it back at him. "This seat doesn't seem right. Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" A beat of silence. "Yes," he replied evenly. "It's my assigned seat." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll need to double-check with the system." She turned on her heel, heels clicking against the floor as she disappeared into the galley. Around him, passengers exchanged whispers, some already sensing something wasn't right. Minutes later, she was back. But now, her stance had changed. More rigid. More final. "I've checked the system," she announced, her voice clipped. "There's been an error. I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy." The man blinked once. "There's no error," he said, his tone as steady as before. "This is my seat. You check my ticket yourself." Her patience thinned visibly. "Sir, I'm not asking. You need to gather your belongings and move to the back of the plane. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to involve security." A hush fell over the cabin. Eyes locked on the confrontation. A ripple of discomfort spread through the first-class section. Some passengers leaned in, others shifted awkwardly. The man, still seated, exhaled slowly. "I'm not moving." His voice wasn't loud, but it was resolute. The flight attendant's nostrils flared. "Sir, you're holding up the boarding process." More whispers. More glances. Then, a new element, a glow. A reflection in the cabin windows. People were filming. The man saw it too. His eyes flickered across the sea of screens before landing back on the attendant. "You can call whoever you need to," he said simply. Her face darkened. Without another word, she spun and stalked toward the galley. But the moment she disappeared, a passenger across the aisle lifted their phone higher, tapping the screen. The quiet hum of speculation spread. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because minutes later, the flight attendant returned. And this time, she wasn't alone. The flight attendant's confidence cracked. For the first time, she felt the weight of the watching eyes. Dozens of them locked onto her, dissecting her every move. The man in the seat said nothing, but his gaze never wavered, steady, unshaken. And that's when it hit her. She wasn't in control anymore. A beat of silence. Then, without another word, she turned. The flush in her face deepened as she retreated toward the galley, her steps brisk, her posture stiff, but her grip on authority slipping with every step. Back in the galley, her breath came quicker. She paced, muttering under her breath, her earlier certainty unraveling. She knew the passenger's warning wasn't empty. That video? It could spread. It could mean complaints, investigations, maybe worse. Her pulse pounded as she snatched a phone from the counter, fingers shaking as she dialed. The supervisor arrived moments later, his expression already weary. "What now?" She gestured sharply toward first class. "That passenger, he's being disruptive. Other people are getting involved. It's becoming a problem." The supervisor let out a slow, measured sigh, rubbing his temples. "I spoke to him. His ticket is valid. There's no reason to escalate this further." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "You don't understand. He's making me look bad in front of the entire cabin. And now people are filming." A long pause. The supervisor studied her, his gaze unreadable. Then, with quiet finality, he said, "Linda, stop. Right now. The more you push, the worse this is going to get for you." For a moment, she looked like she might argue. Her jaw tightened. But the supervisor's tone left no room for debate. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, gripping the counter, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, the energy had shifted. The murmurs had quieted, but tension still lingered in the air. The man sat calmly, his book open once more unbothered. Across the aisle, the recording passenger's fingers flew over their phone, sharing updates with what was clearly a growing audience. Then, chime. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I understand there has been some commotion in the cabin. Please remain in your assigned seats and allow our crew to complete boarding. We appreciate your cooperation." The words were calm, measured, but the message was clear. The situation had reached the captain. Back in the galley, Linda's breath hitched. The captain knows. A cold dread settled in her stomach. This is bigger than me now. Her hands trembled as she reached for a glass of water, taking a shaky sip. In first class, the man's lips curled into the faintest smirk. He flipped a page in his book, completely unfazed. But Linda? Linda was losing control. Passengers were talking, whispering. The video recorder had stopped filming, but was now engaged in quiet conversations with others, likely recounting every detail. And in the midst of it all, the man sat calm, composed, his quiet confidence making Linda's actions seem more out of line with each passing second. Her stomach churned. She grabbed her phone again, this time dialing ground operations. "This is Linda," she said, her voice low but clipped. "I need you to log a report for me. There's a disruptive passenger in first class, and I may need assistance when we land." A pause. Then, a voice on the other end. "Disruptive how?" Linda hesitated. The words should have come easily. But when she reached for them, nothing. "He's refusing to comply with instructions," she said finally, though even she could hear how weak it sounded. Another pause. Then, "Has he broken any airline rules?" Her mouth opened, then closed. "Not directly," she admitted. The voice on the line grew firmer. "Linda, unless there's an actual safety concern or violation, it's best to de-escalate. You don't want this to get bigger than it already is." bigger than it already is. The words hit her like a gut punch. She hung up without responding, her frustration bubbling over. This was slipping through her fingers. She wanted control back, needed it back. But the more she pushed, the further it slipped away. Meanwhile, in first class, the atmosphere was shifting again. Passengers were taking sides. A woman across the aisle leaned in, her voice hushed. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. It's unbelievable." The man nodded, his voice steady. "Thank you. It'll work out." From the galley, Linda saw it. The small nods of support. The quiet solidarity growing in the cabin. And that's when it stopped being about the rules. This felt personal. Her hands clenched into fists. Her jaw tightened. No. She wasn't going to let him win. She squared her shoulders, adjusted her uniform, and strode toward first class, ready to reassert her authority. But before she could speak, "Excuse me," a voice rang out from the aisle, loud and unwavering. The recording passenger had stood up. "I think it's time someone from the airline takes responsibility for what's happening here." A wave of murmurs rippled through the cabin. Heads turned. More phones lifted. Linda froze. From the galley, the supervisor rushed back. "What's going on now?" His voice was firm, but there was an edge of exasperation. The recording passenger gestured toward the man. "He's been harassed for sitting in his assigned seat. And I've got it all on video. If this is how your airline treats paying customers, you've got a bigger problem than you think." The supervisor's jaw tensed. He turned to Linda. "We've already confirmed his ticket." His voice was quiet, but sharp. "Why are you still pursuing this?" Linda opened her mouth. No words came out. The eyes of the cabin were on her now, and the weight of it pressed down heavier than ever. Then, chime. The intercom crackled. "This is the captain speaking. I'd like to request the cabin supervisor to report to the cockpit immediately." The supervisor hesitated. He glanced between Linda and the passengers before nodding. "I'll be right back." His voice was tight as he disappeared into the cockpit. Linda stood alone in the aisle. And in that moment, she felt it. The shift. Passengers weren't whispering anymore. They weren't just glancing. They were glaring. The man in the seat? Still silent. Still watching her. And for the first time, Linda knew. She wasn't standing on solid ground anymore. Linda's hands clenched against the counter as the weight of the supervisor's words crashed over her. The video. Ground control. Corporate review. It was out of her hands now. The realization hollowed her from the inside out. No authority, no command of presence would undo what had already been set in motion. She sucked in a shaky breath, but it did nothing to steady her. Somewhere beyond the thin curtain separating her from the first-class cabin, whispers continued, low but insistent, a quiet rebellion against her actions. In the cabin, the man remained where he was, his posture easy, his book still open in his lap. But he wasn't reading. His eyes flicked toward the galley every so often, tracking movements, gauging the atmosphere. He could feel the shift, the quiet judgment in his favor. The passengers had spoken in glances, in hushed voices, in the undeniable weight of a cabin that no longer saw him as the problem, but her. The soft shuffle of shoes approached. A different flight attendant, this one younger, hesitant. She stopped at his row, offering a small, uncertain smile. "Sir, is there anything I can get you?" Her voice was softer than the others had been. No edge, no suspicion. Just humanity. He looked up, meeting her gaze. There was something almost apologetic in her stance, like she was trying to offer what little kindness she could in the wake of what had happened. He gave a small nod. "I'm fine, thank you." His words were simple, but the way he said them carried something heavier, an understanding. The attendant lingered for a second longer, shifting on her feet before she spoke again, even quieter this time. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for how you were treated earlier. It wasn't right." A small smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. A few passengers nearby glanced up at the exchange. Some gave small, almost imperceptible nods of agreement. The tide had fully turned now. The man wasn't alone in this anymore. Across the aisle, the recording passenger was still typing furiously on their phone, updates flowing to an audience beyond the plane. They barely glanced up as a soft chime rang out, and then, "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your tray tables are secured." The captain's voice was smooth, practiced, but there was something beneath it, an undertone. Not just an announcement. A message. The man closed his book and placed it neatly on the tray table in front of him. He adjusted his seatbelt, his movements deliberate, his expression unreadable. But he knew. This flight wasn't going to land the same way it had taken off. The man glanced at his watch. Right on schedule. The descent was smooth, routine, except for the storm brewing beneath the surface. He leaned back, crossing his arms, his expression unreadable. But this wasn't indifference. It was control. He understood the weight of timing, the power of letting the truth speak for itself. Everything was already in motion. In the galley, Linda gripped the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. The usual hum of descent, the clicking of seatbelts, the rustle of bags being shifted, faded into background noise against the pounding in her chest. Every second brought her closer to the ground, closer to whatever waited for her on the other side of that jet bridge. "Corporate will see this before we even land." The words looped in her mind, gnawing at what little confidence she had left. Her authority had crumbled. The passengers had turned against her. Even her colleagues looked at her differently now. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. In the cockpit, the captain spoke into his headset, his voice low and steady. "Ground control, this is Flight 472 on final approach. We have an onboard incident involving a crew member. Requesting additional staff at the gate." The reply was immediate. "Acknowledged for 72. We'll have personnel ready upon arrival." The captain exhaled slowly, glancing at his co-pilot, who gave him a knowing look. This flight wasn't going to be just another routine landing. The fallout had already begun. Back in first class, the man calmly reached for his carry-on, unhurried, methodical. He wasn't in a rush. He had seen this play out before, knew exactly where it was heading. Around him, passengers exchanged glances, some curious, some quietly admiring the way he had handled it all. An older woman leaned forward from the row behind, her voice low but firm. "Good for you," she said. "It's about time people like that are held accountable." He met her gaze with a small nod. "Thank you." No anger, no satisfaction, just quiet certainty. Then, the recording passenger, who had been silent for a while, spoke up again, louder this time, making sure everyone around them heard. "I already sent this to a friend in the press." They turned slightly toward the man. "The world's gonna know exactly what happened on this flight." A ripple of murmur spread through the cabin. Linda, still hiding in the galley, stiffened. She peeked past the curtain, scanning the passengers. They weren't just whispering anymore. They were rallying around him. The shift was undeniable. She had lost control of the narrative completely. The supervisor reappeared, his voice clipped. "We're almost on the ground," he said. "When we land, stay in the galley until ground control personnel arrive. Do not engage with the passengers. Do you understand?" Linda swallowed hard and nodded, her throat dry. I was just trying to." He cut her off. "Save it for the review. This is out of your hands now." The wheels touched down with a smooth jolt, and a collective exhale filled the cabin. Seatbelts unclicked, bags shifted, but the tension didn't break. If anything, it thickened. At the front of the plane, Linda's stomach lurched as two uniformed airline representatives stepped inside. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence was enough. The supervisor gestured toward the galley, and they moved in her direction. "Linda," one of them said, firm but controlled, "we're here to escort you off the plane. We'll discuss this further in a private setting." Her breath hitched, but she nodded stiffly, smoothing her uniform as if that could somehow restore the authority she had lost. As she walked down the aisle, heads turned. Murmurs followed her like a shadow. Judgment. Disapproval. She could feel it pressing in from all sides. The man watched as she disappeared down the jet bridge. There was no gloating in his expression, no sense of triumph. Just the quiet understanding that justice, once set in motion, had a way of unfolding on its own. As he stepped off the plane, a different airline representative was waiting for him. This one met his eyes with respect. "Sir," they said, their tone careful, "we'd like to speak with you briefly about what happened. We deeply regret the treatment you experienced and want to assure you that this is being taken seriously." He gave a slight nod. "I'll be happy to discuss it," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's make sure this doesn't happen again." They led him into a private lounge, away from the bustling terminal. The room was small but formal, plush seating, a table with neatly stacked documents. Two additional representatives arrived, their faces tight with professionalism. The senior one spoke first. "First, we want to sincerely apologize for what happened on your flight," they said. "We're here to listen, and we want to ensure this is handled appropriately." The man took a seat, his posture unwavering. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here because I want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did today." They nodded, taking notes as he recounted the incident. He was precise, unemotional, but his words carried undeniable weight. "It wasn't just about being asked to move," he said, leaning forward slightly. "It was the way she looked at me, the way she spoke to me, like I didn't belong. That's not something you forget." The representatives exchanged uneasy glances, scribbling down his words. The senior member cleared their throat. "We want to assure you that the behavior you experienced is completely against our values. This will be fully investigated, and there will be accountability." The man didn't break eye contact. "Accountability is important. But what about prevention?" His voice was calm, deliberate. "This wasn't just one bad employee having a bad day. It's a bigger problem. What's your airline doing to make sure this never happens again?" A pause. The question hung heavy in the air. Finally, the senior representative spoke. "We're already implementing additional training, bias awareness, de-escalation protocols. This incident has made it clear we need to do better, and we will." He studied them for a moment, then nodded. "I want to see those plans," he said. "Policies and promises are one thing. Action is another. If your airline is serious, I expect to be kept informed." His directness caught them off guard, but they nodded. "Of course," the senior rep said. "We'll provide updates, and if you have recommendations, we're open to hearing them." "I do." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "And I'll share them. But understand this, I'm not looking for a free upgrade or an apology letter. I want real change." Silence. The gravity of his words settled over the room. The representatives glanced at each other, absorbing the weight of what he had just said. "You're absolutely right," the senior member finally said. "We'll make sure your voice is heard, at every level." The meeting wrapped up, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because somewhere beyond the walls of that quiet lounge, the video was still spreading. The story was still unfolding. And the world? It was watching. They handed him a business card, direct contact with the airline's internal review team, and promised a follow-up within the week. The senior representative, her face carefully composed, extended her hand. "Thank you for your patience and for bringing this to our attention. I hope we can earn back your trust." He shook her hand, brief and firm. "We'll see," he said, voice steady. "Actions speak louder than words." As he stepped out of the lounge, the air outside the tense meeting room felt different, charged with possibility. This wasn't just about one flight attendant or one bad experience. It was about something much bigger. He had been treated as though he didn't belong, but today he made sure they knew otherwise. And now they had no choice but to listen. Meanwhile, in a stark, windowless room across the terminal, Linda sat stiffly in a chair, hands locked together in her lap. The two airline officials across from her were unreadable, their professionalism only making the weight in her chest heavier. One of them finally spoke. "Linda, we've reviewed the reports from the flight crew, the captain, and the passengers. We've also seen the video." His voice was measured but unyielding. "Your actions today violated multiple airline policies." Linda's mouth opened, ready to argue, but he cut her off with a raised hand. "Before you say anything, this is a formal review. You'll have the opportunity to provide your account, but the evidence against you is substantial." Her throat tightened. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just trying to." "To what?" The second official leaned forward, eyes sharp. "You singled out a passenger who had done nothing wrong. You escalated the situation. You disrupted the flight and caused reputational harm to this airline. That's not just doing your job." Linda's gaze dropped, fingers twisting nervously in her lap. There was nothing to say. She had no defense. The decisions that had felt so automatic in the moment now stood exposed under the harsh light of scrutiny. The first official sighed, setting down his tablet. "We'll finalize our review and notify you of the outcome within 24 hours. Effective immediately, you are suspended from duty pending further investigation." The words hit like a gut punch. Suspended? She barely managed to nod. The officials stood, gathered their notes, and left her sitting there, alone in the cold, silent room. For the man, today had been a confirmation of what he already knew. Bias was ingrained in systems, hidden in plain sight, disguised as protocol. For Linda, it was a reckoning she never saw coming. And for the airline? It was a crisis that would test whether their words about change were anything more than empty corporate promises. At the baggage claim, a few passengers from the flight hesitated before approaching him. One, an older man in a casual jacket, was the first to speak. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what you went through today. It was hard to watch." He nodded, appreciative but measured. "Thank you." A younger woman, balancing a baby on her hip, added, "You handled it with so much dignity. I don't think I could have stayed that calm." He offered a faint smile. "Sometimes, calm is the loudest voice in the room." They lingered, waiting to hear more, but he kept the exchange brief. Their support was meaningful, but his mind was already on what came next. When his bag finally arrived, he thanked them once more and walked out into the night air. Outside, the city lights shimmered in the distance. A sleek black car service waited at the curb, the driver, courteous, professional, opening the door. "Good evening, sir. I trust your flight was all right." The hesitation was telling. The man didn't elaborate, just nodded, stepping inside. As the car pulled away from the airport, he reached for his phone. He wasn't done. Drafting an email, he kept it sharp, direct, leaving no room for evasion. He addressed it to the customer relations team, senior leadership, and a few names within the airline that carried real weight. He outlined everything: How he was treated, the deeper implications, the need for accountability beyond a mere apology. Then, at the end, a simple but unshakable demand. I am not seeking compensation or superficial apologies. I am seeking meaningful, systemic change. Please confirm when I can expect to see a detailed plan of action. He hit send, exhaling as the email disappeared into cyberspace. The battle wasn't over. It was just shifting to another battlefield. Meanwhile, in the airport parking lot, Linda sat in her car, staring blankly at the steering wheel. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in like a weight in her chest. Her phone buzzed on the dashboard. A message from a colleague. What's going on? I saw a post about a first-class passenger in a video. People are saying it's you. Her stomach dropped. Hand shaking, she unlocked her phone and started searching. It didn't take long to find. The video, her video, had already spread. Thousands of views. Hundreds of comments. And the reactions were brutal. Disgusting. How does someone like this even have a job? Good for that man. He handled it with more class than she ever could. This is exactly why we need better bias training. Fire her. Each comment hit like a fresh punch to the gut. Linda locked her phone and dropped it onto the passenger seat, gripping the wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream, to blame someone else, but deep down, she knew. She had done this to herself. At corporate headquarters, the fallout was already in motion. Senior executives sat around a long conference table, watching the viral video play on a massive screen. When it ended, silence hung heavy. The head of customer relations was the first to break it. This is bad, she said, her voice grim. Not just for the PR fallout, but for what it says about our culture. We can't dismiss this as an isolated incident. A second executive leaned forward. We need a response plan now. If this gains more traction, we're looking at a full-blown crisis. At the head of the table, the CEO finally spoke, his voice cold and firm. No more Band-Aid solutions. No more empty PR statements. We need real action. He looked around the room. Draft a plan for mandatory bias training across all departments. I want recommendations on systemic changes that prevent this from happening again. And someone get in touch with the passenger. We need to show him, and the public, that we are taking this seriously. The room snapped into motion. Everyone understood the stakes. This wasn't just about a rogue flight attendant or a bad day. It was about the airline's future. About trust, and about whether they had the courage to truly change. Hours later, as the man arrived at his destination, his phone buzzed with an urgent reply. Subject: Urgent response. Flight 472 incident. Dear Mr. Ellis, thank you for your detailed account. We are deeply sorry for what you experienced. Please know that we are committed to addressing this at every level. Attached is a preliminary outline of the steps we are taking, and we would welcome your input as we refine our plans. We value your voice and hope to work with you to create lasting change. Sincerely, Jessica, Senior Customer Relations. He read it once, then again. It was the start of something. But whether it would lead to real change, that remained to be seen. One thing was certain. This wasn't just a bad flight. It was a turning point. And everyone, from Linda to the airline's top executives, was about to find out just how much turbulence was still ahead. The senior manager cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. We understand your concerns, Mr. Ellis. That's why we're here, to make changes. The man's gaze didn't waver. Then let's talk about what those changes actually look like. The tension in the room thickened. Jessica Lang, the CEO, leaned forward, clasping her hands together. We've already started implementing mandatory bias training across all departments, not just for flight attendants, but for everyone. from ground staff to corporate leadership. He nodded, unimpressed. Training is a step. But what about accountability? What happens when this inevitably happens again? A few executives exchanged uneasy glances. They had spent the past 24 hours scrambling to control the damage, but now they were being forced to confront the deeper issue, one that couldn't be fixed with PR statements or corporate buzzwords. Jessica exhaled sharply. We're establishing a dedicated oversight committee, a third-party body that will handle complaints like this with transparency. The man leaned back, considering. And Linda? Silence. Jessica hesitated. She's been suspended pending further review. Given the circumstances, termination is likely. He studied her expression, searching for signs of hesitation, of performative damage control. But she looked resolute. This can't just be about firing one person, he said, voice steady. Linda's actions were wrong, but she didn't create the culture that allowed this to happen. That's on all of you. Jessica didn't flinch. Which is exactly why we're changing it. The room remained silent. No one had expected him to be this direct, this unwavering. After a long pause, he finally nodded. Then I'll be watching. With that, he stood. The meeting was over, but the fight wasn't. Meanwhile, miles away, Linda sat frozen on her couch, staring at her laptop. The email had come through. Final decision. Termination of employment. Her hands trembled as she scrolled down, reading the clinical language detailing her dismissal. A line stood out. This decision reflects our commitment to fostering an inclusive and respectful environment for all passengers. Her mouth went dry. It was over. No appeals. No second chances. She had spent years in this career, climbing the ranks, believing she was good at her job. But now, the weight of her choices crashed down on her with suffocating clarity. She glanced at her phone. The text had stopped coming. Friends who once checked in had gone silent. She was alone in this mess, left to face the consequences of a moment she could never take back. Outside, the world kept moving. News anchors dissected the airline's response, headlines continued to spread, and social media had already moved on to the next outrage. But for Linda, this was the moment everything changed. And for the airline? This wasn't just about fixing one mistake. It was about proving, to the world and to themselves, that they could truly be better. But the question remained, would they? Jessica's expression remained firm. We've already begun implementing bias training for all staff. We're also revising our escalation protocols to ensure situations like yours are handled better in the future. The man nodded, but his gaze stayed sharp. Training and protocols are a start, but they're not enough. Bias training without accountability is just performative. Escalation protocols are meaningless if your employees don't recognize when they're operating from a place of bias. And none of it will matter unless you actually listen to your customers, to your staff, especially to those who are marginalized. Jessica didn't hesitate. We understand. And we're committed to making these changes permanent, not just a reaction to this incident. We're building better feedback mechanisms, conducting regular evaluations of staff behavior, and ensuring our hiring and training reflect our values. The man studied her. Good. Then let me suggest something specific. Create a passenger advisory council. Bring in people from diverse backgrounds. Let them review your policies. Let them hold you accountable. Murmurs rippled through the boardroom. Jessica's eyes brightened. That's an excellent idea. It could help bridge the gap between the company and the communities we serve. But he wasn't done. One more thing. The flight attendant, the one who started all of this. What's happened with her? Jessica's expression darkened. She's been suspended. Based on our review, termination is likely. The man nodded slowly, considering. I'm not here to advocate for her. But I will say this, she's a symptom, not the disease. Firing her won't fix your problem. It might quiet public outrage, but if you don't change the culture that enabled her behavior, this will happen again. And next time, you might not get a chance to fix it." The room went silent. The weight of his words settled over them like a storm cloud. Jessica finally spoke, voice steady. "You're right. This isn't just about one incident. It's about who we are as a company. And that has to change from the ground up." The man leaned back in his chair, unwavering. "Then I'll be watching. And so will everyone else." The meeting ended with cautious optimism. The airline's executives promised regular updates. They invited him to be part of the advisory council once it was established. As he left the boardroom, he knew this fight wasn't over. But real progress had been made. Across the city, Linda sat in a cold, unfamiliar office, facing judgment of her own. The disciplinary panel loomed before her, their voices sharp, clinical. "Do you understand the gravity of your actions on that flight?" Linda's throat tightened. "Yes," she said quietly. "I made assumptions I shouldn't have. I didn't handle the situation appropriately." One of the panelists leaned forward. "This wasn't just a procedural mistake. Your actions reflected poorly on the company. You undermined the trust of our passengers." Linda swallowed hard. "If I had the chance, I'd listen. I wouldn't let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I'd follow protocol and treat every passenger with respect." A brief silence. The panelists exchanged glances. Then one of them spoke, her tone softer. "It's clear you understand the impact of your actions now. However, given the severity of the incident and the attention it's received, we have no choice but to terminate your employment." The words hit Linda like a punch to the gut. She nodded, numb. She had expected this. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real. As she left the office, her shoulders slumped. She wasn't just walking away from a job. She was leaving behind a version of herself she could never return to. Weeks later, the man stepped onto another flight with the same airline. Something felt different. The staff greeted him warmly. Their professionalism was real this time, not forced. As he took his seat, he watched them interact with passengers. There was a new attentiveness, a kindness that had been missing before. A flight attendant approached with a smile. "Thank you for flying with us again. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let us know." He nodded. "Thank you." The flight was uneventful. When they landed, he stepped off the plane with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Change was slow. There was still work to do. But for the first time, he felt something new. Hope. At the airline's headquarters, the Passenger Advisory Council held its first meeting. Diverse voices filled the room. Ideas, experiences, and frustrations were shared. At the head of the table, Jessica Lang listened, truly listened. She took notes, asked questions. She understood now. This wasn't just about fixing one mistake. This was about proving, to the world and to themselves, that they could be better. Because in the end, that flight wasn't just an incident. It was a turning point. For the man, it was a chance to stand against something bigger than himself. For Linda, it was a painful, necessary reckoning. For the airline, it was a test of whether mistakes could lead to real change. The ripples of that day would spread far beyond one cabin, one company. And the world was watching. Thanks for watching. If you found this story powerful, give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.